Welcome everybody. My name's Claire Cordeau. I'm the Director of Healthcare here at Simulate, and I'm absolutely delighted to be able to present to you Reece Holbrook, who's the Technical Fellow, Cardiac Rhythm and Heart Failure Economics, Reimbursement and Evidence at Medtronic. I had the pleasure of meeting Reece a few months back, and he told me about some of the work that he'd been doing at Medtronic. And I was very, very pleased when he agreed to talk to all of you here today about the work that he's been doing. As some of you will know, we have regular presentations of people's work who've been using Simulate and how they've been making a difference to real-world questions. So we're always delighted when people are prepared to talk about it.
Hello, everyone. This is Reece, and my background is actually I was trained and educated as an electrical engineer and did design work for a long time, and my focus in those days was the simulation of integrated circuit designs. And so, and I went through a wandering career journey and ended up in clinical research and health economics, and I found in my new role an opportunity to, I discovered this new technology that Simulate makes discrete event simulation, and because of my background, it made sense to me to try and apply that technology to the problems I was facing. So I was pretty excited about having that opportunity. So let me go ahead and get started with what we did. To give you some background, let me tell you a little bit about the health technology that we'll be discussing today to help you get a background to understand that. We're going to talk today about the value of EP lab efficiency. And when I say EP lab, I'm referring to a room in the hospital that's specifically designed for use by electrophysiologists to perform cardiac procedures. These would be people who would implant pacemakers, defibrillators, and do other things as well. Specifically, we're going to discuss efficiency gains in the context of catheter ablation for atrial fibrillation. So ablation is basically taking a tool down into the heart and causing a little damage to the heart tissue to stop it from conducting electrical signals. And when we talk about atrial fibrillation, it's unwanted electrical signals in the heart. So if you look on the left side of this screen, there is a technology that has traditionally been used for this purpose, and it's called radio frequency, or RF, ablation. These are catheters that do ablations point by point. And because they were originally being used to treat other types of arrhythmias. When you do an ablation for atrial fibrillation, the goal is to create a circle of ablation around the opening to the pulmonary veins in the heart. So you can see here there's been a few dots of ablation done by this catheter, and the goal is to create a fully continuous circle around that opening. Now, this procedure is complex with a lot of variability, and it usually takes several hours to do this. Medtronic has developed a unique AF ablation catheter on the market called Arctic Front Advance cryoballoon ablation catheter. Now, the shape of that catheter is instead a balloon, right? And you can imagine if you blow up this balloon and put it in the opening to this vein, it is contacting in a perfect circle around the entrance to that vein. And then it can deliver energy and ablate the tissue that forms that circle. So you can create this ablation in a single application rather than many small applications. It's a lot like if the difference between drawing a circle, if you had a pen, by creating a series of dots in a circle shape with the pen rather than drawing a line. And it's compared that to having a stamp that if you made a stamp, it would make a perfect circle right away. So we know that the first and most important discussion about any new medical technology is about its clinical efficacy and the safety for the patients. For the purposes of this discussion, we'll assume that the clinical evidence has been established and physicians believe it's the right technology to add to their practice and use with their patients. What we want to focus on now is the tangible and intangible values of the efficiency of these procedures. So what you're looking at now is data that came from a clinical study that we performed comparing RF ablation catheters to cryoballoon catheters. And this clinical study was aimed specifically at the efficiency of the procedures. So the focus of that clinical study and the traditional focus of these things has been on a metric called procedure time. This is basically the time it takes the physician to perform the ablation, so that when the physician makes the first incision into the patient, performs the procedure, and then closes that incision, that is the procedure time. Right? And there was a nice reduction in procedure time that we observed in this clinical trial. However, this metric is becoming less and less meaningful over time to hospitals. For one example, many physicians in the United States here are becoming employees of the hospital. So the time that they spend is important, but doesn't have the same level of importance economically. What has a little more meaning these days is what we would call lab occupancy time. And now this is the time that the patient spends in the room, and it does include the procedure time, but it also includes preparation time and recovery time after the procedure. And so this is longer. But what it represents is the time that the room is being used, or this resource is being used for that patient and can't be used for any other procedures. Another thing that was I want to draw your attention to is what was reported in this clinical study when it was published was this interesting metric called standard error of the mean. So you can see these procedure times take, hours, right? And they're being reported in minutes here. The standard error of the mean is a measure of how close the measurement in the clinical study is to the true mean. And you can see if something takes 247 minutes, the standard error of the mean is about 3 minutes. The actual variability or the standard deviation of this would be much larger. And so we'll talk about that a little bit later in this presentation. So there's a lot of data here, but we haven't yet really explored what this means to the hospital administrator. And when I say the words hospital administrator, what I mean is the person in the hospital who's most closely managing this EP lab resource. So the exploration, and actually it was my responsibility to explore what this meant to the hospital administrator and how to show them the value. So I talked to many hospital administrators around the United States. We had advisory boards where we brought, dozens of them in, and I went out and traveled and talked to some of them at their hospitals. And what I learned was that the evidence that we had provided so far was not very meaningful to them. We had done things like tried to quantify the economic value of this in cost per minute. Now, cost per minute is interesting, right? It tells you how you're spending your money. But what they told me was, Reece, if this procedure ends sooner, I'm still paying for that room and it's just sitting there empty. And the staff I've hired to perform these procedures, if they get done sooner, I can't send them home early and save money. So the cost per minute wasn't a very meaningful metric. As I discussed already, focusing on procedure time wasn't as meaningful for them. That showing these averages and helping them understand the averages without the variability wasn't very impactful. And then it was assuming only this procedure time data mattered and there wasn't anything else that mattered. And so what I did learn on the other side of this slide was that metrics that were important to hospital administrators in this case were things like avoiding overtime. So if they had days where the procedures went so long that people were there past the end of their shift, that was undesirable. And what also was desirable to them was if cases ended soon enough that that room could be used for other cases, that was useful as well in terms of treating more patients and potentially having profitable procedures. The lab occupancy time meant more to them, and understanding the detailed distribution and the true variability of these procedures and accounting for that was important, and accounting for the real-world complexity. And I'll talk about real-world complexity in just a moment. So diving a little deeper into how we decided to use this information we gathered from these hospital administrators is there was a connection to what they were asking for, the richness of data that we did have, and the modeling approach to transform the data that we did have and the way we were showing it into a new thing that mattered to them. So we started with going back to the raw data that we got from the clinical study And what you see here is a histogram of procedure times, both for the top is for the cryoballoon technology, the middle is for RF technology, and the bottom is those two curves superimposed on top of each other. And what we learned is not only did we have this 36-minute reduction in the average procedure time, what it did also appear is that the longest procedures were less with the new technology as well. In fact, if you look at the 90th percentiles, there's about a 1 hour difference. So the very worst cases would take about an hour faster with the new technology. So that was impactful. And then we tried to account for the real-world complexity from the administrators, and I talked over and over again, and I kept expressing to them what I thought their problems were. And then they would say, Reece, there's one more you don't know, and here's that new one. And this is a good sampling of what those things are. They were like, yeah, your technology may be 30 minutes faster, but my doctor will come 30 minutes late to his case, and I've lost that. So sometimes their EPs or their electrophysiologists wouldn't come to the case on time, for good reason, but still late. Sometimes the patient's lab results would be delayed, and they wouldn't be able to start the case until they were finished. Sometimes the room turnover would be complicated, and that would cause problems. Sometimes the patient would simply not be able to get to the room because nurses weren't available to push them there. And so all of these different things, what we did was we took all of those different things and we put them into a model so that I could tell the hospital administrator, they'd ask me, Reece, did you account for room turnovers? I mean, yeah, we got that in here. Here's how we put it in here. Here's how it behaves in the model. And then eventually it got to the point where they're like, okay, now I think you understand me, and I'm willing to look at the results of your model. So what you're seeing now in the lower right here is a block diagram of how the model behaves. And it's probably not the most complex model you'll ever see, but at least it accounts for everything that was of interest to our administrators. And what we have here is basically what happens is in a hospital is since these procedures will take a couple of hours, they will attempt to do 2 cases per day. And they do them according to a block schedule. So they'll start the first case at a fixed time in the morning, and even if they finish that case early, they won't start the second case until the block schedule defined time for the second case. Right? But if that first case goes longer, it will push the second case out. So what happens in this model is, first of all, the patient arrives at the hospital according to that block schedule. Now that patient may get there on time and may not. And that patient may go through certain delays before they're available to be in the operating room. And then as a separate part of the process, the EP arrive comes in at the beginning of his shift. And what he will do is he will start doing things that he thinks are useful things. So he doesn't just run in and stand next to the operating table and wait for the patient to come. He's busying himself with what he thinks are useful tasks. So I call these task delays. They may go anywhere from 5 to 60 minutes. Now that EP, once the time has come for the procedure to happen, he'll go and check and see if the patient is there. If the patient isn't there, he's going to go back and do some other things. He's not going to just sit there and wait. Then even if the patient were to come 1 minute after the EP check, he's still going to finish whatever task he went off and went to do. And that's the source of why the EPs come late sometimes to procedures. Once all this has sorted itself out and they're both there together, they will go into the procedure room. We'll pull a procedure time off of these distributions, which Simulate has some really nice capabilities. These particular curves are best fit as gamma curves. So we put a gamma curve into Simulate, and it pulls random procedure times off of those curves. And then that patient exits, and the doctor goes back to his loop and waits for that second case to occur in the day. So with all that said, hopefully that's a reasonably clear understanding of how the model is supposed to operate. I've actually captured a brief video of the model in operation. What you're going to see is, oh, excuse me, I pressed the wrong button. One moment, let me get a hold of my cursor here. And okay, there we go. So now the model is going to start working. I have the time turned down really low so you can see the workings of the model. What's happening here is you can see that up here on the upper line, this is the RF line. The patient got to the RF case first, right? And then the cryoballoon case started afterward. Now it's completed that case, and that doctor is off to his tasks. The cryoballoon case ended. Now we're going on to the second case of the day. And the second case of the day actually started, RF first as well. But what we can find here is that when that day goes on to completion, what happens is that second RF case took longer, and they ended up in overtime that day, right? Whereas the cryo second case went quicker, and they didn't end up in overtime. Now the model's speeding up, right? It's repeating this over and over again, days of 2 ablation cases, and we're seeing the accumulation of days of overtime, hours of overtime, which is this graphic up here as well, and then also days where both cases got done and there was room for another case, right? And when I say room for another case, what I mean is there was at least an hour day in that lab. They don't attempt another ablation case, but they can go in there and do something that's quicker to do, which is a pacemaker implant, an ICD replacement, or some other case. And most of these cases are margin positive for the hospital, so they want to do more of them if they can. Now that you've seen that, there is another thing that's important to do when you're building models, and that's called validation. In other words, is the model predicting something that I didn't build into it to predict? And one of those things we did to validate this model was we looked at what was the time that patients exited from the EP lab after the second case, right? So it's a marker for how long both cases took. And we put in how long individuals' cases would take, and we put in all the operation of when patients arrive and doctors arrive and rooms turnover and all those things. But we didn't necessarily put in when the second case should end. That was something the model needed to predict. And what you're seeing here is data from the clinical study on the left side. The darker data is raw data from the clinical study that when that second case would end during a day, and the afternoon case would end. On the right side is the lighter data is the simulated version from the simulation. And what we did is we just sort of, first of all, we just eyed this up and we said, well, that looks very similar. So we're feeling good about the model. It isn't biased above or below what's predicted in real life. And then we did some statistics on it too, the mean and the variability of it, and it also looked very similar to the real data as well. So that gave us more confidence the model was properly accounting for all of the different variabilities. And I'm making it sound cleaner than it really was. The very first version of the model, we looked at this and they were off from each other, and then we explored, well, why were they off from each other, and talked more about it and found, oh, there was something about the variability of how the doctor acted that I just didn't get the first time around in conversations with physicians. So we went in there and got that fixed. So on to the results of the simulation model. So the simulator predicted a meaningful improvement in the metrics for efficiency that the hospital administrators indicated were meaningful. So the first thing we'll look at is days of overtime, or overtime avoidance, I would call it. So overtime avoidance is not necessarily the biggest direct money saver for hospitals, but it's recognized as something that improves staff satisfaction. And that is sort of like, you can tell them they save money and that gets their attention. And then they sort of come to this conclusion that, wait a second, if my staff, one of my biggest problems is my staff going into overtime. And they genuinely worry that if they overwork their staff that they will lose them. Those nurses have options. They can go work in another part of the hospital or at different hospitals, right? And they're very difficult. It's very difficult because of the technical difficulty of these procedures to get a nurse who can support an EP lab procedure. They're hard to replace and they're hard to train. So that's important to the hospital administrators. But even so, the costs do accumulate meaningfully over time, and we do show them, if you look at it annually or over even a longer period of time, that this adds up as a cost that's meaningful as well. The second metric that has been impactful with our administrators is the days with an incremental procedure. So you can see that we go from, if you use RF technology, that's happening, upwards of 20% of the time. And if you use cryoballoon technology for both cases, that can happen almost 2/3 of the time. So we take these data, and when we talk with our customers about it now, we combine these data with outcomes research data, so data into hospital financial databases, to estimate hospital costs, revenue, and margin per case. These data can be combined with these simulation results to enable estimation of annual financial impact of the choice to use cryoballoon over RF for a specific hospital in the United States. This sort of presentation we use a lot at hospitals where the physicians already desire to use cryoballoon technology, but they've run into a barrier at their administration level in investing in it. So when they need to do these ablation cases, there's a capital outlay at the beginning. There's a generator, it's called, that is a fairly big, substantial piece of equipment that sits in the EP lab and generates the energy that allows the ablation to happen. And that's a 6-figure investment for the hospital. So when we reach a situation where the physicians believe it's good clinical choice for their patients, and the hospital administrators understand there can be real economic advantages coming from efficiency, then we can overcome these barriers to adoption. And finally, since we completed this model, and we completed this model and we started using this with our customers and having some success with it, we went on to publish the output of this simulation model in the Journal of Invasive Cardiology. This was last year, and this lends further credibility to these localized hospital presentations when we do them. So with that said, I've completed what I want to tell about my project, and I'm very interested in having an interaction with you over what questions you might have.
Reece, thank you so much. That was a fascinating study. Thank you so much for putting it together for us and taking the time to talk to us about it. There's a couple of questions that have come through, so I'm going to put them to you on behalf of everybody else. One is about the impact that that's had on adoption. Can you say anything about that?
Yeah, it's good. One of the things is I'm not a field person, so it's rare when I get to go out there and observe. By the time it's come to here, I've enabled our field to apply these data. So, but I do hear anecdotes. I've heard, a handful of anecdotes when we first released this. Oftentimes the field person would be so excited about the way it went, and it was a new thing that they hadn't done before, that they'll write me an email and say, "Wow, this data really helped me." I had a hospital administrator who was completely against doing the investment, the capital investment to allow their physicians to do the first cryoballoon case, even though the physicians wanted to. And when we presented this data, that enabled them to sort of relent on their position and go ahead and invest in the thing and allow the first cases to be done. So and then after some months, then it became a little more. It became less novel to our field, and they stopped telling me those stories. But I assume that continues to go on. It continues to be an important part of the tools that our field uses when they're trying to sell this new technology.
That's good to know. Do they actually take the simulation out themselves and talk to people about it, or do they just show your slides?
Oh yeah, that's an excellent question. And at the beginning I had imagined that I'd be flying out to hospitals and I'd pull up the simulator and I'd say, "Tell me your average times and we'll go ahead and run the simulator," and they would see it in action. And it turns out that the hospital administrators are, as long as you tell the story in a credible way, they don't necessarily need to see it in action. So we don't actually run the simulator station in front of them. Now, in one case, we actually did take in some specific hospital data and rerun the simulation and provide the results for them with their own localized data. But in general, they seem willing to accept these generalized results that are published, and they for the most part will accept the simulation data as it is. The thing that we do always localize to the individual hospital is the costs, revenue, and margin results, and then they are applied to the more generalized outcome from the simulator.
Right, thank you very much. There's another question that's come in about whether this is normal practice for you to look at the wider context around your procedure. Could you say anything about that?
Yeah, I would say it's something we are evolving. I would say 10 years ago, wouldn't have imagined doing anything like this. It's I'm an engineer. This is a very technology-focused company. We're making the greatest new thing. Now, our founder, Earl Bakken, always said, you need to walk around in hospitals. You need to watch them do things. They can't always tell you what's important to them. You need to see it for yourself. And so we did have that part as well. But in general, it was sort of like we felt like if we made a technology like this that we knew made the procedures faster, we had done our job, and the world would come beating our door to use this thing, right? But as time goes on, we find that really understanding their whole situation and trying to figure out, well, how would you measure your success? And it doesn't end at the thing that we as Medtronic imagined we could measure. That this is a thing that our current CEO, Omar Ishrak, is really encouraging the whole company to do. And you will, if you ever encounter him in the, he's often on the news or talking at some conference, he's always saying these same things. We need to be able to show the economic value of our technologies, and we need to do it. He would use the words, to express the quantified financial benefit to the target customer. And it's a very loaded phrase where it's got to be quantified. So you need a number, and it needs to be financial, and it needs to be a benefit to a target customer. So in the case of what we talked about today, it's the hospital administrator who's most specifically responsible for managing the EP lab resource. But so it forces us to go out there and say, who cares about this? Whose life does it affect? Can we get to a point where we show them how it changes dollars in their budget? And so it's an evolution, but we've come a long way from where we used to be.
Yeah, it sounds like that. Thank you very much. So another question, if you don't mind. This question is: are costs and revenue applied after the simulation, or does your model include costs? So some of them will be stochastic.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. The model I built, and actually it was kind of funny because I had first started using Simulate, and I had another project in mind that I wanted to do, which was much more complicated, and I thought, well, I'm sort of learning how to use this. I'm going to do something relatively simple. And so I built this model, and I didn't really put the quantified dollars into the model itself. I mean, I could have, and I have since done that. But this particular model, it comes out with the result you saw, right? I mean, days of overtime and days with incremental procedure. And what I do is separately, I just have a simple spreadsheet calculator that I've built that has the results of the simulation in it. And then what we do is we go into the outcomes research databases and pull out if we're doing a specific hospital presentation. And in fact, actually, I've taken all this capability and given it over to someone in our field organization, and they do it themselves now. But they will pull out the specific finances for that hospital and put them in the spreadsheet calculator, and that will generate the final sort of output. If I was doing it today, I would probably, well, that's a good question. I would have to meditate over whether I would want to build that into the simulation or if I would do that in a calculator outside. But I think both methods are viable.
Thank you very much. It's interesting that you outline it in that way, because I'm guessing that every one of us are on a simulation journey, and as you learn more what you can do and how you can solve problems, you can get more and more complex in the way in which you run a model. But actually, you've got a publication and some real value out of a relatively simple model.
Yeah, but one thing I have seen is internal to Medtronic. If I build dollars into my simulation, eyes get wide open and they pay better attention to it. If I simulate, like this model is like, oh, that's neat, Reece, you know, and then, but when I get it quantified to the dollars, it was only when I got it quantified to the dollars that I really got attention. So I have been leaning a little more towards putting those dollars right in the simulator.
That's I think that's good advice for everyone who's building simulations and wants people to pay attention to them. Thank you very much, Reece. I think that's probably all the time we've got now for questions. If anyone's got any additional questions for Reece, do please send them through to us. And we have a LinkedIn page, which Simulate in Health, which if people aren't members of that group, please do join. We can keep the conversation going there. Reece, if you're willing to answer questions after this, if people are interested in pushing them to you, is that okay? Are you willing to do that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I would love to help you. There were many people who helped me in my journey, and I'd be willing to do the same.
That's great to know. Reece, thank you so much for your time. Really, really great presentation, lots of insight there. And thank you to everybody who joined. We'll have we'll be sending out details of the next in our series of webinars, so we hope to see more of you again. And meantime, please do continue the discussion on our LinkedIn group or email us, and we can pass the questions on to Reece. And if anybody's on the line who wants to tell their story about using simulation to drive improvements in health, we'd love to hear from you, and we're always looking for examples so that you can share them with others. Thank you so much for joining. Great to talk to you, and thank you so much, Reece.
All right. You're welcome. Bye.
Bye.